The iron wheels of the Southern Pacific locomotive shrieked against the rails as the train groaned into the station at Tucson in the territory of Arizona. It was September of 1882. The platform shimmered under a heat so punishing it seemed to bend the air itself into waves. The smell was of creosote, locomotive grease, and somewhere underneath it all, the dry copper tang of desert earth baking beneath an indifferent sky. Margaret Holloway stepped down from the passenger car with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had been taught that grace was never to be surrendered, not even in the most trying of circumstances. She wore a traveling dress of deep sapphire wool, its collar embroidered with tiny ivory flowers, its hem already collecting the red-brown dust of the Arizona territory as though the land itself were making a quiet claim on her. In one gloved hand, she carried a canvas travel bag reinforced with leather at the corners. In the other, she clutched a single folded letter, creased so many times along its folds that the paper had gone soft as cloth. She was 26 years old. In the drawing rooms of Charleston, South Carolina, that age was still considered acceptable, though whispers had begun their quiet work. She had spent her early years as a pianist and French-language tutor to the daughters of merchants and sea captains. She was accomplished. She was graceful. She was also, as of the previous December, entirely without means. The fever had taken her father in November and her mother the following week, as though one could not bear to remain without the other. The house on Trad Street, with its deep piazzas and its walled garden full of camellias, had been sold to settle debts she hadn't known existed. Her father's brother, a cold, ledger-minded man who smelled always of pipe tobacco and mild contempt, had informed her with businesslike efficiency that there was nothing left. Not for her, not for anyone. She had done what a woman in her position was not supposed to do. She had read the matrimonial notices at the back of a regional gazette with something other than scornful amusement. She had read them with the practical eyes of a woman who understood that hope, stripped of its romantic ornamentation, was simply the decision to continue. One advertisement had stopped her cold. "I'm a man of 38 years, rancher in the Arizona territory, and I will not waste your time with flattery. I own 700 acres of canyon land, a stone house with a good well, and a silence so complete it has taught me to think more deeply than I ever managed in the noise of civilization. I seek a wife who does not fear solitude, who values a real conversation above a social performance, and who can find beauty in a landscape that offers none of the obvious comforts. I have read enough to know that the world is large. I am looking for the woman willing to occupy a small, honest corner of it with me." The man who had written it was named Cord Rutledge. Over the following 8 months, they had corresponded with a regularity and an intimacy that still astonished her when she thought about it. His letters arrived once every 2 or 3 weeks, written in a spare, muscular hand on plain paper, with no affectation and no wasted words. He wrote about the geology of the canyon walls near his ranch, how the striated limestone recorded millions of years of a vanished sea. He wrote about the coyotes that sang outside his window on cold nights, a sound he had come to find companionable rather than mournful. He quoted Marcus Aurelius and Robert Burns. He described a late afternoon in April when a thunderstorm had broken over the Rincon Mountains and turned the sky every color between bronze and violet in the span of 20 minutes, and how he had stood on his porch watching it and felt, for the first time in a long while, something approaching contentment. Margaret had answered every letter with the full weight of her intelligence and her longing. She had told him about the music she missed, about the particular quality of light on Charleston Harbor in the early morning, about the novels she had read 3 times each because they were all she had left of the life that had vanished. She had told him about her grief, which she hadn't been able to discuss with anyone else, and he had written back with a plainness and a gentleness that undid her completely. "Grief is not a problem to be solved," he had written. "It is a country you are made to live in for a while. The only honest thing I can tell you is that the country has borders even when you cannot see them." She had fallen in love with the man in those letters. She had constructed him carefully, the way one assembles a mosaic from scattered fragments. She had imagined someone lean and weathered, but with an air of composed intelligence about him, a man who would carry the quiet authority of someone at peace with himself. She had imagined his handshake would be firm, but his manner unhurried, the way she imagined a gentleman farmer in Virginia might carry himself. She had imagined wildflowers, or at least a simple, dignified welcome. The locomotive released a final, exhausted sigh of steam. The platform crowd thinned rapidly in the heat, leaving Margaret standing alone with her bag and her letter, and the sun hammering down on the crown of her wool hat. She felt slightly dizzy. She felt very far from home. She felt, beneath all of that, a fear so thorough it had gone quiet, settling into something cold and hard in the center of her chest. A figure separated itself from the shade of the depot's overhang. He was not what she had built in her mind. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical density that suggested he had done heavy labor for a very long time, and the labor had won. He wore a canvas shirt the color of old bone, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, the fabric dark at the collar with sweat. His trousers were the practical brown of a working man, tucked into tall boots whose leather had been resoled at least twice. He wore no hat at that moment, carrying it instead in one hand. His hair was dark, threaded through at the temples with iron gray, and cut with blunt practicality rather than any care for fashion. His jaw was covered in a beard that was not the groomed, deliberate beard of a fashionable man, but the beard of a man who shaved when occasion demanded it and not otherwise. He was not handsome in any way she had previously understood the word. He was watching her with eyes the color of old amber, intelligent and measuring, and utterly without the softness she had wanted to find there. He crossed the platform with a ground-eating stride, unhurried but direct, the way a man moves who has learned not to waste energy on anything that isn't necessary. He stopped 4 feet from her. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't unkind. It was simply honest, and honesty, she was discovering, could feel very much like exposure. "Margaret Holloway," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and flat, with the faint remaining ghost of a Tennessee accent worn, almost smooth by years in the desert. "Yes," she said. The word came out smaller than she intended. Cord rattled. He reached out and picked up her travel bag from beside her feet. "We've got a long drive ahead. The buckboard's around the side. There's water in the canteen if you need it before we start." He turned and walked away. Margaret stood for a full 3 seconds, staring at the spot where he had been. He hadn't smiled. He hadn't offered his hand. He hadn't said a single word about being pleased to finally meet her, or glad she'd arrived safely, or any of the dozens of small social acknowledgments she had unconsciously expected. He had simply picked up her bag and moved toward the wagon as though the meeting of 2 strangers who had agreed to marry was a logistical matter to be addressed efficiently. She followed him. She had no other choice. She had spent the last of her money on the train ticket west. The buckboard was a heavy, battered thing, drawn by 2 mules with the placid, relentless look of animals that had long since made their peace with hard work. Cord Rutledge stowed her bag under the seat with careful efficiency and climbed up to the driver's side without particular ceremony. Margaret gathered the hem of her sapphire wool dress and managed the step herself, because it was clear no assistance was coming, and settled onto the plank seat beside him. The town of Tucson slid away behind them. The road, if it could honestly be called that, became a rutted track pressing north and east through a landscape unlike anything Margaret had ever seen or imagined. The saguaro cactus stood at intervals like enormous silent figures, arms raised in poses that seemed, in her increasingly unsteady state, almost imploring. The mountains ringed the horizon in every direction. Blue and purple and ancient-looking, indifferent to human drama. The sky above was the most relentless blue she had ever seen, a blue with no mercy in it, a blue that went on forever. Cord Rutledge did not speak. Miles passed. The sun moved. Margaret's wool dress, appropriate to Charleston September mornings, became a quiet form of suffering. She drank from the canteen he had mentioned, the water warm and slightly mineral, and thought about the letters. She thought about the man who had written about the striated limestone and the coyotes and the violet thunderstorm. She looked at the profile of the man beside her, cut hard and unsmiling against the enormous Arizona sky, and tried to reconcile the two. The advertisement said 700 acres, she finally said, because silence had become something she could no longer comfortably inhabit. 740 now, he replied without looking at her. Bought the next parcel east 2 years ago. And cattle. Some Maury horses. I run a breeding operation, quarter horses mostly. There's a market for good working stock that doesn't dry up the way cattle prices do. It was the most he had said at once. She took the opening. The letters, she said carefully. You wrote about the canyon walls, the layered limestone. You described it in such, she searched for a word that wasn't accusatory, such particular terms. I had imagined someone who spent a great deal of time in contemplation. He glanced at her then, briefly, with those amber eyes that gave nothing away easily. I do, he said. Contemplation doesn't require a different set of clothes. It was not unkind, but it was a correction, and she felt it as such. I wrote you honestly, he said, returning his gaze to the track ahead. Every word in those letters is what I meant. I didn't promise you a parlor or a social life or a man who's kept himself soft. If you read something else into them, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding, but it wasn't my doing. Margaret pressed her lips together and looked out at the cactus and the endless red-brown ground, and said nothing more for a very long time. The Rutledge Ranch revealed itself after 3.5 hours of travel, emerging from a fold in the terrain where the land dropped slightly into a broad, flat-bottomed canyon threaded through by a thin line of cottonwood trees following an arroyo. The house was built of pale adobe brick, low and solid, with walls 18 inches thick that Margaret would later learn were the reason the interior was bearable even in summer heat. There was a long covered porch along the south-facing side. There was a stone well with a wooden cover in the yard. There were corrals and a substantial adobe barn, and the smell of horses and hay and the particular mineral dryness of desert air just before the afternoon wind came up. There were no flowers. There was no welcoming committee. There was a gray dog of indeterminate breed who came trotting around the corner of the barn and sat down near Cord's boots with an air of professional dignity, as though checking in for a shift. That's Pio, Cord said. He's civil if you are. Margaret looked at the dog. The dog looked at Margaret with the calm assessment of a creature who has seen many things come and go and formed opinions about all of them. She followed Cord Rutledge into the house. It was spare, almost severely so, but it was not without quality. The main room held a heavy mesquite table, 4 chairs, and a stone fireplace large enough to heat the whole space. The floor was packed earth covered in woven rugs of red and ochre and cream, and there were books, shelves of them, built directly into the adobe wall, filled with volumes whose spines showed genuine and repeated use. She saw Aurelius as promised. She saw Thoreau and Emerson, Dickens and George Eliot, a Spanish grammar, and what appeared to be a comprehensive geological survey of the Arizona territory. Your room is through there, Cord said, gesturing toward a doorway covered with a heavy wool curtain. There's a bolt on the inside. The well is in the yard, and there's a copper basin on the washstand. I'll sleep in the barn until we've stood before a preacher, which I expect we can arrange in town within the week, if that suits you. Margaret turned to look at him. You didn't have to offer that, she said. I did, he replied simply. I told you I'd conduct this marriage with respect, and I meant it. You don't know me yet. He looked at her steadily for a moment, and she realized that what she had initially read as blankness in his expression was not emptiness at all. It was restraint, the deliberate, practiced restraint of a man who had learned at some point that showing everything you felt was a form of vulnerability the world was not always trustworthy enough to handle carefully. Cord, she said, before he could turn away, I owe you an apology. I had built a picture of you in my mind that wasn't entirely fair to what you actually told me. I arrived here looking to find that picture, and when I didn't, I was unkind, if only in my thoughts. He was quiet for a moment. You weren't unkind, he said. You were honest. The picture doesn't match and we both know it. We'll see if the real thing is worth staying for. He left through the front door. She heard his boots on the packed earth of the yard, and then nothing but the wind moving through the cottonwood leaves along the arroyo, and the distant, liquid sound of horses shifting in their stalls. Margaret sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in the small room he had given her. She put her face in her hands. The sapphire wool of her dress felt preposterous here, in this spare adobe room in this canyon, in this vast and alien territory. She thought about the trad street house and the camellias in the walled garden and her mother's voice singing softly in the kitchen on winter mornings. She allowed herself, very quietly, to grieve. Then she washed her face in the copper basin, straightened her back, and went to investigate the kitchen. The first 2 weeks constituted the most humbling education of Margaret Holloway's life. She had kept a house in Charleston, in the way that women of her background kept houses, with the assistance of people who actually knew how to do things. She had supervised, she had arranged. She had never once built a fire in a wood stove because there had always been someone for that. She hadn't known that ignorance until she stood in front of Cord Rutledge's cast iron stove on the first morning and felt the complete blankness of having no idea where to begin. She burned the cornbread until it was a geological sample. She made coffee that Cord drank without comment, though his expression, drinking it, was the expression of a man performing an act of remarkable self-discipline. She scalded herself twice with the kettle and sliced her palm shallowly on the edge of a tin pan, wrapping it herself in a strip of cotton because asking for help felt, in ways she couldn't entirely explain, like a defeat she was not ready to accept. Cord said nothing critical. When the cornbread was carbonized, he ate it. When the coffee was terrible, he finished the cup. He showed her once, without commentary or condescension, how to arrange the kindling before laying the heavier wood, how to regulate the damper on the stove to control the heat. He showed her once, and then he did not show her again, understanding, apparently, that she would prefer to figure the rest out herself. She did figure it out, imperfectly at first, then better, then competently. The cornbread became edible within a week. The beans she put on to cook in the morning were ready and properly seasoned by evening. She learned, from a neighboring rancher's wife who rode over one afternoon on a piebald mare with the no-nonsense air of someone with a great deal to do, how to make the particular kind of slow-cooked beef that kept a working man on his feet through a 16-hour day. The neighboring rancher's wife was named Dora Sepulveda, and she was one of the most competent people Margaret had ever encountered. She had 6 children, 300 head of cattle, an opinion about everything, and absolutely no patience for pretension. "So you're the Charleston woman," Dora said, the first time they met, looking Margaret over with frank appraisal. "Cord told us he'd sent for someone. We were curious." "Were you?" Margaret said, meeting her gaze steadily. Dora smiled quickly and genuinely. "You'll do," she said. "Come, I'll show you what to do with that chili he's got drying in the kitchen. You have no idea what it's for, do you?" "None whatsoever," Margaret admitted. Dora laughed, a full and generous sound. "Good. Honesty is a better start than I expected." Margaret began to learn, through Dora and through her own relentless trial and error, the deep grammar of this place. She learned the difference between the plants that were useful and the ones that were merely there. She learned which clouds meant a storm was coming and which ones were theatrical but empty. She learned that the desert, which had seemed at first like a landscape of pure deprivation, was in fact extraordinarily alive, teeming with a life that had simply adapted itself to conditions that appeared, on the surface, to offer nothing. She began to think that she might understand something about that. 3 weeks after her arrival, she and Cord were married in the small territorial courthouse in Tucson. She wore the sapphire wool dress, the only good dress she had, and she had pinned her hair simply and practically rather than in the elaborate construction she'd arrived in. Cord had shaved cleanly and worn a white shirt that smelled of the cedar chest where he stored it. They stood before a territorial judge and said what was required of them. The ceremony took 11 minutes. Cord shook the judge's hand afterward. Then he offered Margaret his arm in a gesture of courtesy that surprised her with its formality and walked her out into the white October sunshine. "Well," he said, "that's done." "That's done," she agreed. They stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, husband and wife in the eyes of the territory of Arizona, two strangers who had exchanged the most intimate thoughts of their inner lives through the mail and who were now, in every legal sense, responsible for each other's futures. "Are you sorry you came?" he asked, not looking at her, watching the street. She considered the question honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "Are you sorry you asked?" He looked at her then, and something moved briefly behind the amber eyes. "No," he said, "not yet." It was not a declaration of love, but it was something she found, to her own surprise, she could build on. The test, when it came, arrived with no warning, the way the most serious tests always do. The winter of 1882 moved into 1883 with a cold that the old-timers said was unusual even for the high desert, a cold that came on bitter winds from the north and froze the water in the troughs before dawn. Cord was deep in the preparations for foaling season, which would begin in February, and the weather was making everything harder. He worked from before light until after dark, and when he came inside, he was so thoroughly spent that conversation amounted to little more than the practical exchange of necessary information. Margaret watched him grow thinner. She watched the lines of his face deepen with fatigue. She understood, for the first time, the full weight of what he carried: the ranch, the horses, the fragile economics of a breeding operation that depended on the health of animals that could die from a cold night, a broken leg, any of a dozen random disasters that no amount of work or care could prevent. In late January, while Cord was riding the eastern fence line to check for damage from the ice storms, a mare in the far corral began to foal early, and it went wrong almost immediately. Margaret had never assisted in any kind of birth. She knew almost nothing about horses beyond the elegant abstractions of her previous life in Charleston. She had been given a basic account, by Cord, of what to watch for during foaling season, but watching for something and knowing what to do when it happens are entirely different kinds of knowledge. The mare was in distress. Margaret could see it clearly through the corral fence, the animal moving in the particular circling, straining way that indicated things were not progressing as they should. She ran to the barn, where the hired hand, a young Apache man named Ambrose who worked 3 days a week, should have been. He wasn't there. He wasn't anywhere she could find. She stood in the barn doorway for perhaps 30 seconds, calculating. Cord was an hour's ride away at minimum. Ambrose was absent. Dora Sepulveda was 3 miles to the west. The mare was suffering. Margaret Holloway, née Charleston, rolled up her sleeves and went into the corral. She talked to the mare the entire time. She talked to her in French and in English. In the low, continuous, even murmur she had once used to calm nervous students before recitals. She used her hands with a gentleness that she hoped would communicate, across the vast difference of species and circumstance, that she meant no harm. She did what she could remember Cord telling her, and what instinct supplied where memory failed, and when it seemed as though the situation had passed the boundary of what she could manage alone, she did not panic, but rather moved her thinking into a slower, more deliberate gear, the way she had learned as a child to do when a piece of music was too difficult and falling apart. Slow it down, find the shape of it, work the hard passage one small piece at a time. An hour later, Cord came back to find his wife in the corral, covered in evidence of her afternoon, sitting in the dirt with her back against the fence post. Beside her, the mare was on her feet, recovering. The foal, a small and currently bewildered filly, was attempting her first uncertain steps on legs that seemed to her an implausible engineering solution to the problem of standing. Cord sat down in the dirt next to his wife, without saying anything for a long moment. "Is it all right?" he finally asked. "She," Margaret said. "It's a she, and yes, I think so. Ambrose wasn't here and I couldn't reach you and I wasn't going to simply watch." Cord looked at the filly for a while. His face did the thing she was beginning to recognize, the thing where the restraint moved, briefly, and let something else show through. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "I worked it out." He looked at her then, at her ruined dress and her dirty hands and the exhaustion in her face, and something shifted in his expression so completely and so permanently that she felt it like a change in the weather. "What do you want to name her?" he asked. Margaret looked at the filly, who had achieved all 4 feet and was regarding the world with a kind of affronted dignity. "Charleston," she said. Cord made a sound she hadn't heard before. It took her a moment to identify it as laughter. There were harder days ahead. The spring brought a drought that stretched the desert's already minimal charity to the breaking point. The well dropped 3 feet, and Cord dug it deeper by hand, coming up at the end of each day with a kind of exhaustion that Margaret had no previous vocabulary for. She watched him and understood, gradually and then completely, that what she had mistaken at the train station for brutishness was in fact something else entirely. It was the particular kind of strength that doesn't come from comfort, that cannot be cultivated in drawing rooms or developed through genteel education. It was the strength of a man who had been tested by conditions that were absolutely real and had chosen, every time, to continue. She stopped mourning the man she had imagined and began to pay attention to the man who was actually there. She noticed the way he handled the horses, which was the way you handle something you genuinely respect, with patience and consistency and without any cruelty. She noticed the way he was with Pio, the grey dog, whose devotion to Cord was the kind that only accumulates through years of being treated honestly and well. She noticed the books he returned to, and the particular passages he had marked, and how they corresponded to things he had said in the letters, not as performance, but as evidence of an actual and ongoing inner life. She noticed the wooden flute. She found it one evening, by accident, on the shelf behind the Aurelius, a small hand-carved thing of polished juniper, simple and beautiful in the way of objects made with genuine care for their function. She picked it up without thinking. "Put it down carefully," Cord said from the doorway, his voice perfectly even. She set it back on the shelf with deliberate gentleness. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to presume." He came in and stood looking at it for a moment. "It was my grandmother's," he said. "She brought it west from Tennessee when she was 19 years old. She played it every Sunday morning of her life until the week she died." He was quiet for a moment. "I play badly, but I play." "Would you?" Margaret asked. He looked at her, assessing something. Then he picked up the flute and stood by the window in the last of the evening light and played. The sound was rough in places, unpracticed and unpolished, but the melody was there, clear and unmistakable beneath the roughness. It was a Scottish air she recognized, something sorrowful and unhurried, the kind of tune that seems to have existed before anyone composed it. When he finished, he didn't look at her. "Cord," she said, "I played piano for 20 years. I would like, if you would allow it, to play with you sometime, if you could find an instrument for me." He was very still for a moment. "There's a mission in town," he said at last. "They have an old upright. Sister Magdalena might let you use it if I ask." "Ask her," Margaret said. He played the flute, and she played the mission piano, on the Sundays when they could make the drive. It was awkward at first, the way the beginning of any real collaboration is awkward, each person learning the other's rhythms and hesitations and particular tendencies. But they found their way into it slowly, the way they were finding their way into the marriage, with patience and honesty and the willingness to keep showing up. The drought of that spring became the crisis they had not expected. By June, the arroyo was dry for the first time in Cord's memory, and the water table had dropped far enough that the well was failing. 3 of their horses needed to be sold to raise money for the emergency water they had to haul in barrels from town. Margaret sold 2 of the 3 dresses she owned and her mother's garnets, which she had carried across the country in a small velvet pouch inside her travel bag. She sold them to a merchant in Tucson without permitting herself to think about what she was doing, because thinking about it would have undone her, and she could not afford to be undone. She brought the money home and laid it on the mesquite table. Cord stood looking at it for a long moment, then he looked at her. "You sold the garnets," he said. "Yes. Those were your mother's." "Yes." He sat down at the table and put his hands flat on the wood and said nothing for a while. When he looked up, his amber eyes were very bright. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he said. "I'm sorry this is what your life has become." She sat down across from him. "Don't be," she said, and she meant it entirely. "I sold a dead woman's jewels to save a living woman's ranch. My mother would have understood that. She would have done the same." He reached across the table and put his rough, scarred, overworked hand on top of hers, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the most intimate moment they had shared. The drought broke in August with rains so sudden and so generous that the arroyo ran 2 feet deep within an hour, and Cord stood on the porch, watching the water come down from the canyon walls with an expression of pure relief so unguarded that Margaret, watching him from the doorway, felt she was seeing him more clearly than she ever had. She walked out onto the porch and stood beside him. The rain hammered the desert, and the smell of wet creosote and wet earth rose up around them, that particular smell of the desert after rain that she realized, come to love as deeply as any smell she had known. Cord looked at her sideways. "Still sorry you answered the advertisement?" he asked. She thought about the train platform in Tucson and the man who had walked out of the shade of the depot, nothing like she had expected, carrying all the weight of a life lived without any softness. She thought about the foal and the garnets and the terrible cornbread of the first week and the mission piano and the juniper flute. "No," she said, "not for a single moment that I can honestly remember." He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together watching the rain turn the canyon floor to a moving sheet of bronze, and it was the first time that Margaret Holloway, now Rutledge, felt that she was standing precisely where she was supposed to be. The ceremony of their first wedding anniversary was small, a meal she cooked from memory of her mother's recipe for shrimp pilau, adapted for the ingredients available in the Arizona territory, which required significant improvisation. A bottle of wine Cord had kept in the cellar for an occasion he hadn't yet been able to name. The flute, played in the lamplight after dinner. He gave her, on that occasion, a small carved wooden box he had made himself over the course of the winter, in the hours before dawn when he couldn't sleep. On the lid he had carved, with surprising delicacy, a spray of cottonwood leaves. Inside, on a bed of folded cloth, was a length of cord braided from 3 strands of the silver horsehair he had saved from the tail of the first mare he'd bred, and a small paper packet that she opened to find a pressed desert marigold, brilliant orange even in its dried and preserved state. "I don't have much in the way of gifts," he said, watching her, "but I wanted you to have something that was from here, something that was from this particular life." She looked at the horsehair and the flower and the beautiful utilitarian box. She thought about the jeweled brooches and the silver candlesticks of the life she had inhabited before, all of it gone, sold, or lost, none of it missed with any urgency. "This is better," she said, and meant it in a way she could not have explained to the woman who had stepped off a train in a sapphire wool dress 14 months before. The years that followed wrote themselves in the particular language of the Arizona Territory, in the vocabulary of dry summers and brief, wet winters, and the long, layered work of building something that could last. They added rooms to the adobe house when they needed them. They planted an orchard of fruit trees along the arroyo, which Dora Sepulveda told them was unlikely to survive the first drought, and which, being told that, they watered with a devotion that amounted to something close to stubbornness, and which survived. They had 4 children, a son named Thomas, for Cord's Tennessee grandfather, twin daughters, Clara and Enia Cutes, the second name chosen in acknowledgement of the territory that had shaped their parents, and a youngest boy, James, who arrived in the winter of 1889 during a snowfall so unusual that Cord said afterward the desert was making an announcement. Margaret taught all 4 of them music, with rigorous patience and without the kind of indulgence that would have made them merely accomplished rather than genuinely skilled. Cord taught them the horses and the land, and how to read the sky for weather, and why the layered canyon walls were a record of time that dwarfed anything built by human hands. She taught them to read Marcus Aurelius and George Eliot. He taught them that neither philosophy nor literature was worth anything if you couldn't also fix a fence and hold your nerve in a crisis. The story of the Charleston woman in the saffar dress became one of those regional legends that don't require embellishment, because the truth of them is already stranger and more compelling than anything a storyteller would have the nerve to invent. People talked about how she had arrived looking as though she'd taken a wrong turn on the way to a ball. People talked about the foal she'd delivered alone, and the garnets she'd sold without a word of complaint, and the mission piano, and the way she'd stood in the corral with her sleeves rolled up doing what needed to be done. Cord Rutledge died in the early spring of 1912, sitting in his chair on the long adobe porch, watching the light come up over the Rincon Mountains in the way he had watched it every morning of his adult life on this land. He was 68 years old. The work had been long and the work had been real, and he had done it without flinching. And when it was finished, he let it go with the same undemonstrative dignity with which he had done everything else. His last words, addressed to Margaret, who was holding his hand, were not literary or philosophical. They were, in keeping with the man's lifelong resistance to ornamentation, "You made this place feel like it was worth building." Margaret Holloway Rutledge lived for another 11 years, long enough to see automobiles and airplanes and to observe with equanimity the replacement of the world she had known by something that moved faster and was less certain of what it was. She watched the changes with curiosity and without particular alarm. She had been changed herself, thoroughly and irrevocably, and she understood that change was not the end of a thing, but only the end of its first shape. On the occasion of her 80th birthday, her daughter Clara asked her whether she had any regrets about the direction her life had taken, about the trade she had made at 26, the drawing rooms and the camellias and the social world of Charleston, for a canyon in the Arizona Territory and a man who had never learned to be charming. Margaret was quiet for a long time, looking out at the mountains and the sky and the cottonwood trees along the arroyo that she and Cord had planted together and that were now enormous, their roots deep in the earth of a place she had made her own. "Only one," she said at last. "What?" Clara asked. "I wasted the first 3 hours being disappointed," Margaret said. 3 hours standing in the dust of Tucson thinking I had married the wrong man. She shook her head with the measured incredulity of a woman reviewing a very old mistake. He was precisely the right man. I simply hadn't learned yet to read what was in front of me instead of what I'd decided I wanted to see. She was buried at her request in the canyon orchard she and Cord had planted, beneath the oldest of the apricot trees that everyone had said wouldn't survive. Next to Cord, whose grave was already marked by a flat piece of canyon limestone on which their son Thomas had carved, simply and at his mother's direction, the first sentence of Aurelius that Cord had ever quoted to her in a letter. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The desert wind still moves through the orchard in the evenings. The cottonwoods along the arroyo still make the sound that Cord once described in a letter as the most honest sound he knew, the sound of something flexible and strong, bending without breaking in whatever comes. And sometimes, if you are very still in the late afternoon light, when the Rincon Mountains have gone to rose and amber, and the air carries the clean smell of the desert after a distant rain, you might hear something faint and clear carried on the wind. The shape of a melody, Scottish and sorrowful and unhurried, the particular sound of a woman who found her home in the most unlikely of places and never once, in the end, wished she'd gone somewhere else.